morning. As many of you probably know, if you follow me on social media, yesterday was a special day. We announced the expansion of Black Press, which is my company, inviting on a news director and about 6 journalists to help us follow what's happening in Minnesota. Anoa, this is so significant because over the last few years, Minneapolis has been the epicenter of this global movement, and it just seems like we've had national story after national story, and there's been this huge need to shift the racial narrative here because mainstream media so often gets it wrong, or they sensationalize our stories. And so there's been this huge need for our stories to be told from our perspective. And as a result, we've gotten a lot of support to be able to do this. And I'm extremely excited because, for the last 2 years, I've kind of been working here on the ground as an independent journalist in a silo. And so to have a newsroom, to have other women of color who are out here doing this, I'm just extremely thrilled about it. And so here you can see these are.
Sorry, I muted myself because James earlier was cracking jokes and I wasn't trying to laugh too loud. But I'm so excited for you. I'm so excited for you. This is amazing. I got to see the post last night and definitely want to connect outside of this to cover because I love the growth we're seeing of independent, local, regional journalism that is driven by Black and other folks of color, in particular, telling, the FUBU model, for us, by us, storytelling and news. And, I've been following, your coverage for a while now. And so it has been, you have also like a few other outlets in the area, but not many that are doing this type of work. So this is exciting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And a lot of these journalists that we're working with are young. For some of them, this is their first opportunity to report. And so we're also really excited about creating an ecosystem because for me, part of my story was having to leave Minnesota in order to get career opportunities. And then coming back to Minnesota thinking I finally had enough experience to work here and still not being able to get career opportunities. And finally being able to just say, you know what, I don't need a network or a station's permission to be able to do this work. I'm just going to do it, even if it just means I just do it online. And so with these young women, we're hoping to train them, to give them hands-on experience over the next few years where they can take that if they want to, and they can go work at some of these other networks with a foundation and a lens that's different than mainstream media, that disrupts the status quo, that shifts the narrative, right? And question some of their standards that have produced inequities in narrative. When I look back at what happened in Tulsa, the Tulsa massacre, which a lot of people don't call it that, because for so many years they tried to minimize the body count, the amount of people who were murdered, right? When you look at the amount of wealth, the Black wealth that was lost during that time. And it all started over a newspaper article that was published that accused a Black man of assaulting a white woman. And not only was there a false accusation in the paper printed, but there was also a call to action. When you look back at one of the earliest reports in the Tulsa Tribune, the headline, it was Nab N who assaulted girl in an elevator. N-A-B, Nab. Nab N, the N-word, who assaulted white woman in elevator. NAB that's not unbiased. That's not objective. That is a clear call to action. And it was that very call to action that incited a white mob that inflicted terror against Black bodies and decimated Black wealth, right? What reconciliation has the Tulsa Tribune given those families for inciting the white mob? There's been no reconciliation. And so it's been interesting over the last few years as I've seen so many people organize around police reform and criminal justice reform, which are very important issues. I have not seen a lot of people organize around narrative justice or media reform. And these are things that are so critically needed. And Tulsa is just one of many examples. Howard University, I don't know, Anoa, if you've seen this, but Howard University is doing a study called Printing Hate, where they're going back in time over the last, 50, 60 years and pulling newspaper clips and showing the hatred that these newspapers printed. And creating a digital archive so that you can clearly point to it. And quite frankly, it's made my job a lot easier because now here it's not just me giving these examples, right, in workshops where maybe 20 or 30 people are showing up to. Now we have a credible academic institution that is going back, doing this research and publishing it so that there's a digital archive we can point to with evidence-based examples of how the media has been used to create inequities, inflict harm, extract wealth, right? And those systems are still in place today in the media. A lot of people don't talk about it, but that's why I get excited about creating a newsroom, because I know that there's a huge opportunity to create a new structure and a new way to do things that does not cause that same historical harm.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you mentioning, I had not heard about the Howard, that documentation process. It's amazing, right? Because like in the midst of, the racial justice protests, the uprising that happened in 2020, we saw newsrooms apologizing for their own way of, participating in white supremacy through the news. We saw the AP issuing guidance on like how people should stop doing things like racially tinged or racially motivated, like be clear with your language. And we've seen a lot of backsliding. I don't even know if to call it backsliding when the question is really like, was there anything ever, actually being done beyond these, like what seemed to be at the moment, brave news moments that challenged the status quo. In many ways, the status quo of mainstream media has continued unbothered the past couple of years in terms of the coverage. And we still see like the regurgitation of police narratives in the media. It's just really interesting. And so, I just think what you're doing and why you're doing it is very critical because like you said, there is the idea that people are unbiased. Like everyone has their own biases that they bring to conversations, right? They have their own framings and understandings. And when you have a viewpoint that leaves out large segments of our communities, of our cities, of our states, that gives a very skewed lens and understanding. Just like our conversation yesterday about crime rates and who is, who is the ones committing crimes, et cetera. There are really clear biases against certain groups of people who oftentimes are Black and other folks of color. And so, projects like this that allow people who actually have a certain understanding and nuance about various community spaces, or even the idea of what is newsworthy, right? Like, who do we talk to? For so long, when we talked about politics and elections, like people only talk to either mainstream party leaders and like at the national upper levels or elected officials, right? Now we see people talking to grassroots organizers and community people about issues around voting and stuff like that as well. So, kudos on getting this off the ground. And I'm so excited for what you all do coming down the pipeline.
Thank you. I'm hoping to have a lot of news stories that I can share on the clock from our reporters. One of the things that we've been following, Anoa, is the increase in overdoses. More than 107,000 Americans died in 2021 due to overdoses. And this is another tragic record that has been set. When you think about folks being in this position where they're struggling with drug abuse. Even I had a friend whose daughter was 19 years old and overdosed last year, just like a day after coming out of a rehab facility trying to get help. And these are our young people, Again, I feel like this is another outcome of people being stuck at home during the pandemic, trying to cope with losing their jobs, trying to cope with not having enough resources, parents trying to figure out how they're going to work from home while their kids are learning at home. All of these things that people had to deal with, and the psychological toll that it took on our country. I mean, we're seeing outcomes that are reflective of people's psychological state of mind.
Absolutely agree. I also think that the interrelatedness, right, between, thinking about how do you provide people access and support to what they need in terms of, jobs, training, mental health treatment and support, regular health treatment support. I mean, mental health is health. So all of that, through broader programs for insurance, and not just insurance, but helping people connect with, it's overwhelming, right? Even having insurance is overwhelming, because then you got to find a provider, a good provider that will actually meet your needs and things of that nature. But one of the things that's really interesting is the shift with this administration, in terms of, I think, the facts that have been rolling on the screen, pointing out that the Biden administration did release, earmarked a set of funding for harm reduction, which actually is something that, advocates who do work around, drug policy, around dealing with, overdose and helping working in communities, have been pushing for various harm reduction measures, whether it's clean needle exchanges, having naloxone available. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Available in kits and things of that nature. But we also saw, disinformation earlier on this year try to kind of attack this by claiming the Biden administration was just going to give people, crack pipes, right? Feeding into the fear that we have, particularly as a Black community, of how how the federal government, how that interplay with them and crack flooding our communities. And so one of the things I think is super critical is that we need to have good information about what is happening, because a lot of things with the overdose crisis, particularly when we started looking at, how it shifted, we started focusing on places like West Virginia, which have, a large white population, and the face of overdose became, certain people. So it became more acceptable. It became more, thinking just even about media bias again, like we were talking about earlier, the face of overdose became someone who looks like, the members of white people's families. And so it became something a little bit more sympathetic. But we need to be really clear about, how this is a widespread issue affecting communities across age groups. And the way in which policy is happening to make sure that people who need the support, whether that is, people who need to get clean and abstinence, or people who need harm reduction support measures, right? Those are things that need to be funded. Those are things that we need education about. And, people also need to know what resources are available for them. But there's also a legislative and political component, because in some states, what is available harm reduction measure-wise depends on the state you're in, depends upon the community you're in. So a lot of things in this country, your ability to have, a vital, a fruitful life, depends upon where you're situated in place and space, because of the way people make decisions around you. So the more we're educated and understand. So I do appreciate you raising this topic, because I think it's something that we don't really talk about at all.
Yeah. Well, and the interconnectedness too, when we're saying, okay, overdoses are up, murders are up, where are there prevention points that can be put in place for all of the above? What is it that we can do as a community, as a collective? What can the government do? And in seeing these numbers, and we saw them as they were happening in real time. And sometimes the things I get frustrated about with the government is, the slow moving process. People need solutions now. Folks need access now, and it frustrates me, the stigma that is put on drug users. I've spent a lot of time in the homeless encampments here in Minnesota, talking to the residents that a lot of people just disregard as druggies, as prostitutes. There's so much judgment. But when you sit down and you actually hear their stories and you hear the trauma and, the life happenings that they've had to endure, and not having access to mental health services, not having access to financial resources to pivot when life throws you a curveball, you can start to empathize and have a better understanding of how some of these people have ended up in the situation that they're in. I remember one woman specifically, telling me that she wasn't homeless until her husband died. And that when her husband died, who was the breadwinner, it just became extremely difficult to figure out a quick plan of how to take over all of the finances that he had been covering. And they were a young couple. This wasn't something that, they were older and had time to plan for. He died unexpectedly to COVID. And so what would you do in that situation, right? Especially if you've been married 15, 20 years to somebody and you're expecting to have, 4 more decades with them and they die unexpectedly. These are the situations or people criticizing folks for not going into shelters if you've never lived in a shelter before, don't criticize people who say, I'd rather live in a tent than a shelter, because you don't even know what it's really like to be in a shelter. Some folks have shared experiences of sexual harassment in these shelters. Some folks have talked about their few belongings they do have being stolen, being assaulted. I mean, there's all types of things that people are avoiding. But needless to say, these are not isolated issues, right? When you look at homelessness, and I bring that up because oftentimes we do see a lot of needles when we go into these encampments. And a lot of the folks we do talk to do say that they're struggling with drug use, right? When you juxtapose the American drug issue against other countries like, let's just say, Amsterdam, that does not criminalize drug use, that has a more structured and monitored approach to drug use, right? There's a bit of control and intervention that can happen with the way in which they distribute drugs and tax drugs, and the same thing with prostitution there. And so it's interesting. If you've ever traveled outside of the country, you may have a different lens on some of these issues and what could potentially be solutions to some of these issues. We are seeing drug overdoses predominantly on prescription drugs. How is that happening? What accountability is being placed on the pharmaceutical industry and on the doctors who are prescribing these pills that are ending up on the streets and killing people? Where is the intervention for that? Right. And I'll say, like, me personally, there have been times like when I got my wisdom teeth pulled or when I broke a bone in my foot, a doctor trying to prescribe me with opioids to manage the pain. And from a very young age, having folks in my family who have struggled with addiction, I want to stay as far away from it as possible because I don't want the risk of being addicted to something that I took to manage my pain, or taking something to manage pain and then never coming off of it, but why is that? Even in the situation where you have a patient who's saying like, hey, I have a high tolerance for pain, and also, I would rather just take ibuprofen. Can I get like the strongest prescription of ibuprofen instead? And maybe, double the amount of that because I don't plan on taking the opioids, but they still prescribe you with the opioids instead. Why are these doctors pushing, this drug down people's throats? And where's the accountability for them being the ones who are prescribing this to people?
Absolutely. I was just thinking about how I've been given morphine twice when I think after my C-section with my first child, and which also was complicated for me with, breastfeeding. How is that going to work? But then also when I was hospitalized in January 2020, leading up to the cancer diagnosis, like I was terrified each time because I'm like, oh my God, it's morphine. Why are they giving me morphine? Like I'm in pain, but like, can you give me something else? And they were like, no, we're going to give you this morphine. And sometimes, you're in so much pain that you don't even have the wherewithal, right? Like I was so paranoid the whole time. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to take this dose, or I'm not, like, you get worried about different things. And especially like when they do start prescribing, it's like, wait, this is the Tylenol with the codeine, or this, you just start thinking about it, especially when you do have addiction issues in the family. We do as well. And so we have to talk more openly about it, because addiction also tends to be something that is treated as a badge of shame. That, we may recognize and acknowledge that we might have addiction issues within our own families, but in our own families, we're not even talking about it. Right. And a lot of times it is seen as a badge. It's seen as shame. It manifests as something to be hidden away and not discussed. And I think we are seeing an overflowing of, a generation, at least, of not talking about these issues, of not educating and informing ourselves about how, these are not necessarily fatal character flaws. There are real things that need treatment. And one point that I really appreciate, advocates who do this work have made is that you can't say that you want to, help people, rehabilitate or work through addiction and prevent overdoses while also criminalizing the same behavior. Yeah. And, that was some food for thought for me, because, on the one hand, you're criminalizing people, but on the other hand, we're saying we want to help. And those two things just don't intersect. They're not complementary efforts at all.
No, not at all. And there's so many things that we criminalize in this country. And it's interesting, when I went to Amsterdam at the age of 16, to have that experience and lens, like, oh, wow, here people aren't shamed and criminalized for specific activities. And so how much of our moral compass is shaped by our government structure? How much of what we believe is right and wrong and what's criminal and what's not is shaped by the laws of the land, which change country by country. And so we have certain people in our country who have these strong convictions about criminals and what is defined as criminal. But that's only here in America. When you go to other countries, these people are just normal people living a normal life because their lifestyle is legal in other countries. And so I do think that we have to challenge this notion of criminalizing people and how that can intercept our ability to be able to provide help, and to see that this isn't a small pocket of the population. And this isn't like just exclusively affecting the Black community. In fact, there's a lot of kids from suburban communities that are overdosing at alarming rates, and the narrative around these issues and the opioid crisis is very different because of it. Is what's happening now, you could go back and parallel it to the crack epidemic in terms of numbers, but think about the narrative around the crack epidemic and the stories that we heard in the media about that, and parallel that now to the opioid crisis and the stories that we're hearing around that. People are not painting opioid dealers out to be these huge, terrible people and the communities plagued with drugs, and just all of the narrative that we heard surrounding the crack epidemic. We are not nowhere near hearing those kinds of stories. And so it's always fascinating to me when we examine the statistics and then we put that side by side with the way that these stories are actually showing up in the media.
Absolutely.
I know, I'm not sure if you're still with us.
No, I am still with you. And I was going to say, I appreciate being here with you again. I'm going to have to come back again some other time, but thank you so much for having me again today.
Absolutely. And we're going to have to get with Rebecca soon to talk about having another ladies takeover.
I mean, it's kind of been a ladies takeover, right? Already unofficially this week, but we definitely all do need to get together on the same show, same platform, same time.
Yes. Unofficially, it has been. I didn't think about that. But it was a different tone when we came in.
It was a different vibe.
We started the day and we started the show and we're like, no, this is the ladies takeover. So we got to bring G back.
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to it. I'm always available to y'all.
Absolutely.
I hope Ben is enjoying his little break.
For sure. DJ